The other night, I was having coffee with a friend, a good guy, a software engineer who sees the world in clean, logical systems. The topic of a viral video came up, one of those clips where a woman publicly slaps a man. Without missing a beat, he leaned forward. "It's a simple input-output problem," he said. "If the input is a strike, an equal and opposite strike is a valid output. It's not about anger, it's about establishing a protocol. If you want equality, the rules have to apply to everyone, regardless of gender." He wasn't being malicious. To him, it was a perfectly balanced equation, a tidy piece of code. For a moment, his logic felt unassailable, almost comforting in its simplicity. It's a sentiment you see everywhere in the comments sections online. But then I thought about another system, a pressure cooker. You can watch the steam hiss out of the valve and call that the first event. But the real story isn't the hiss, it's the invisible, steadily building pressure inside. That confident, simple logic of equal force completely ignores the possibility that the slap wasn't the start of the interaction, but the result of one. And it completely ignores what happens when you treat a human relationship like a bug-free line of code.
That analogy, the pressure cooker, it's essential, really, because it immediately shifts our focus, doesn't it, from that one single thing you see, the hiss or the strike, to the whole system that creates it. When we apply that simple equal force logic your friend mentioned, well, we're completely ignoring the social context, the economic realities, the power disparities. These invisible dynamics are exactly what determine whether a visible action is, a proactive input or sometimes tragically a desperate output. Something that happens because of all that sustained systemic pressure. We absolutely have to look past the punchline, so to speak, and see the whole context.
Exactly. We are looking at the system today. And our mission, really, in this deep dive, is to get into the disproportionate reality of intimate partner violence. We're going to thoroughly challenge this fallacy of equal retaliation. We'll also scrutinize why legal systems, particularly when they try modern approaches like restorative justice, often fail, sometimes disastrously, especially in this context. And then finally, we'll pivot. We'll explore some indigenous humanistic frameworks from Indonesia, specifically this concept of Tepessalira, which offers a different path, doesn't it, towards resolving conflict by fostering deep, necessary empathy. We're searching for safety and equality achieved not through some kind of mechanical balance, but through maybe profound moral and cultural strength.
A much deeper approach, definitely.
Okay, so let's unpack that core idea first, equal force applied to domestic violence. This is where the data gets immediately, challenging. There's this persistent debate, you hear it online a lot, arguing for gender symmetry, the idea that men and women dish out violence in equal numbers.
Right, and that argument often hinges on a real oversimplification of what counts as violence.
Mm-hmm.
If you look very narrowly, maybe at specific, sometimes older studies focusing on minor unreported stuff, maybe slapping, what researchers often call situational couple violence, well, then you might find rates that seem kind of equivalent on the surface.
Seems being the operative word.
Absolutely. The moment you apply more rigor, the moment you shift focus to the severity, the context, the actual consequences of the violence, that idea of symmetry just collapses. It really does. The data overwhelmingly shows a strong gender asymmetry.
And that distinction, situational versus severe, that feels like the key to understanding the pressure cooker, right?
Yeah.
We're not talking about a mutual argument that just escalates equally. We're looking at underlying power structures.
We really have to define that severity gradient. I mean, when we look at global incidents, the data it's stark. The World Health Organization, the WHO, estimates that a staggering 1 in 3 women globally, 1 in 3, has experienced physical or sexual intimate partner violence in their lifetime. That's just, it's clearly not a 50-50 split. And to properly understand that imbalance, we have to distinguish the types of violence. The most dangerous type, the one that builds that intense pressure, is often called intimate terrorism or coercive controlling violence.
Okay, tell us more about intimate terrorism, because that sounds like the chronic pressure we were talking about, the constant heating of the system, not just the hiss.
Intimate terrorism is exactly that. It's systematic. It's rooted in a pervasive pattern of dominance. It's characterized by one partner trying to exert really comprehensive control over the other's life. And it encompasses not just physical acts, but psychological abuse, financial control, even reproductive coercion. We'll probably get into that later. The evidence is just crystal clear on this. This systematic controlling violence is overwhelmingly perpetrated by men against women. And this is the kind of violence that necessitates immediate, sometimes drastic safety measures, medical services, police getting involved, specialized shelters, precisely because it's about systematic domination, not just a fight that got out of hand.
And crucially, the violence that women do commit often falls into a totally different category, right? You called it violent resistance.
Precisely. Violent resistance is typically violence committed by women, often as a form of self-defense against that entrenched, systematic, intimate terrorism we just described. So when we categorize them this way, that simple input-output equation, it just breaks down completely. The motivation is the key difference. It's the difference between, say, an unprovoked strike motivated by a desire for control and a desperate block or maybe a counterstrike motivated purely by fear and self-preservation.
Okay, but let's address a potential tension here because it's something you hear. We just acknowledged that men might underreport violence against them. So if that's true, how confident can we be that this asymmetry isn't partly just a reporting issue rather than a fundamental difference in the violence itself?
That's a really vital point, and it forces us to look beyond just the raw numbers of incidents. We have to focus on the impact and the method. Even if we fully acknowledge potential underreporting by men, the asymmetry of harm remains undeniable. Studies that actually analyze motivation show something really interesting. Even in cases of female-on-male intimate partner violence, the stated motives usually involve things like anger, maybe a need for attention, and this is significant responding to the partner's prior violence.
So it's often reactive even then.
Often reactive. Contrast that with the primary male motivation cited in severe IPV cases, control. The motivations are just fundamentally asymmetrical. They're rooted in maintaining power versus trying to escape it.
Okay, let's delve deeper into that asymmetry of harm then. How do the methods and the consequences differ, even with those reporting challenges?
Well, the methods themselves are vastly different, especially in their capacity for causing serious injury or even death. Men are far more likely to commit what we call severe domestic battery. They tend to employ methods designed to cause maximum damage or instill maximum fear. Things like beating up, joking, or strangling their partners.
And choking is a huge red flag, isn't it?
A massive predictor. Choking, specifically, is recognized by experts as a huge indicator of increased danger of future homicide. It's incredibly dangerous. Conversely, women are overwhelmingly more likely to suffer serious injury as a result of intimate partner violence. But the physical toll is just not comparable in most severe cases.
So even if, hypothetically, the frequency of low-level conflict might seem similar in some very limited studies, the catastrophic consequence isn't shared equally at all.
The consequence is drastically unequal. And when we look at the most severe physical and psychological violations, the data is unambiguous. For instance, women are nine times as likely as men to experience sexual violence from a partner.
9 times.
9 times. So trying to treat a system built on coercive control and resistance with this simplistic logic of equal force, well, it's not just inaccurate. It actively obscures the kind of violence that causes the most severe chronic harm and carries the highest risk of death. It misses the point entirely.
Right, and let's follow up on that idea of chronic harm. Because we absolutely must emphasize that intimate partner violence isn't just a standalone incident or even a series of incidents. It's a source of chronic cumulative trauma. It really acts like that constant pressure buildup in your cooker analogy. The consequences are profound and they extend far, far beyond the immediate physical injury.
And what's fascinating and also quite terrifying is the sheer breadth of the long-term physical and psychological fallout that comes from this chronic stress.
Yeah.
It really does become a kind of health epidemic in itself.
It creates this comprehensive health profile defined by chronic stress and trauma. We know intimate partner violence is strongly associated with increased rates of substance abuse among victims, often as a way to cope,
Right, self-medicating. Exactly.
Yeah.
That includes higher rates of tobacco use, increased reliance on alcohol or other drugs, and then psychologically the rates of depression, severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety disorders, suicidal thoughts, they just skyrocket, alongside chronically low self-esteem, of course.
And the physical toll. Sometimes it's surprising because the symptoms might seem deep connected from the original trauma to an outsider.
That's right. The body itself literally absorbs the trauma. We see specific, persistent physical problems emerge, things like chronic pain syndromes that can be really difficult to diagnose and treat effectively. Victims frequently experience gastrointestinal problems like irritable bowel syndrome, for example. And there's a higher prevalence of gynecological issues too, including chronic pelvic pain and menstrual irregularities. These somatic symptoms are often the body's way of manifesting the stored energy, the long-term activation of the stress response system that happens when you're living in constant danger or under constant control. It's the cumulative effect that really defines the severity here.
And one of the most insidious forms of control, the kind that contributes to this huge fallout, involves reproductive coercion. That's something most people don't immediately connect with physical abuse, maybe, but it maximizes that feeling of being trapped.
This is such a critical point because it directly targets the victim's bodily autonomy and their long-term health trajectory. Victims face significantly higher risks of unintended pregnancies and, crucially, sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. This is often a direct result of reproductive coercion. This can manifest as forced or coerced sex, obviously, but also the perpetrator actively manipulating or controlling access to contraception.
How does that control over contraception actually look in practice? What forms does it take?
It can take several forms, and they're all designed to maintain control and dependency. It might be hiding or destroying birth control pills. Refusing to wear condoms is a common one. Or, and this is a particularly prevalent and frankly violent form, the act of non-consensual condom removal during intercourse. It's often referred to as stealthing.
Right, I've heard that term.
It's a deliberate tactic. It's designed to assert biological control, maximize the risk of pregnancy or disease transmission, and ultimately ensure the victim remains tethered to the relationship. It just maximizes that systemic pressure we keep talking about.
And the cycle, tragically, doesn't stop with the victims themselves. The trauma becomes intergenerational.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Children who witness intimate partner violence, even if they aren't directly physically harmed themselves, they internalize those dynamics. They can come to see them as normal or maybe just inevitable. Statistically, these children are far more likely to become either victims of IPV themselves later in life or, sadly, to become perpetrators of violence in their own relationships. This ensures that the traumatic pattern is essentially inherited. It gets perpetuated across generations, demonstrating exactly how the system feeds itself. It's heartbreaking.
So moving back to the data collection for a moment, we need to talk about the difficulties in getting accurate, non-skewed data on this. What really stands out to you about the challenges researchers face in trying to accurately quantify this issue?
Well, what stands out is just how sensitive and hidden this topic really is. I mean, because domestic violence involves behavior that's socially frowned upon and happens mostly in the private sphere, it naturally leads to serious underreporting, pretty much across all demographics. Specifically, as we noted, men are often less likely to report domestic violence perpetrated by female partners, which certainly contributes to the difficulty in understanding the full picture. But the challenge is often greatest in populations where maybe literacy or access to standard survey methods is a barrier.
So how do researchers try to overcome that underreporting, especially in diverse populations, maybe people who might distrust official surveys or forms?
We saw this challenge tackled quite effectively in research conducted in places like Curacao, for instance. Researchers there were dealing with a highly sensitive topic in populations where literacy rates or, general accessibility might be factors. Think about low-educated groups or perhaps elderly demographics. They found that relying only on self-administered questionnaires, like just handing out a form, would seriously skew the data downwards. People just wouldn't respond, or wouldn't respond honestly. So the crucial adaptation was using a tailored, mixed data collection method. Specifically, they offered a face-to-face interview option with trained personnel, someone they could talk to.
Offering a choice.
Exactly, and the results were really telling. Over half of the elderly respondents actively chose the face-to-face method. They preferred it. This kind of careful approach helps correct what we call non-response bias. It pulls in data from respondents who would otherwise have been completely missed, providing a much more truthful representation of prevalence.
That attention to methodology really matters, doesn't it? It ensures that those who might be most vulnerable are actually represented in the data we use to understand the problem. Okay, before we move on, there was one counterintuitive finding about the perpetrators themselves that kind of jumped out from the research about the role of education in psychological abuse.
Yes, this is a really vital finding because it complicates that common assumption, that sort of easy belief that higher education somehow inoculates people against becoming violent or abusive. The research actually found that psychological domestic violence, the constant demeaning, the ridiculing, the emotional manipulation, that coercive control stuff, is actually perpetrated more often by respondents with higher education levels.
Really? That seems backwards.
It does seem backwards, but it raises an important question. Why doesn't intellectual capacity prevent this kind of controlling behavior? It really reminds us that this is fundamentally a power problem, not simply an education deficit. Intelligence can sometimes, unfortunately, enable more sophisticated, more insidious methods of control. Methods that leave fewer physical marks but cause profound, lasting psychological harm.
Okay, so we've established that IPV is asymmetrical, it's chronic, it's deeply rooted in these control dynamics. The standard punitive system, well, it's often too slow or inaccessible or maybe even re-traumatizing for victims. This has led many jurisdictions, and we see this particularly in Southeast Asian contexts like Indonesia, to explore non-punitive legal approaches, specifically restorative justice, or RJ. The idea is to seek reconciliation, maybe break the cycles of conflict.
And the search for alternatives, it's certainly driven by good intention. There is a desire to seek reconciliation and healing outside of that often lengthy, damaging criminal justice process.
Absolutely.
However, and this is a huge however, implementing restorative justice in cases of gender-based violence, especially where the fundamental issue is coercive control, where it's systematic dominance, well, it presents a profound and often fatal danger.
Okay, why? Why does RJ, which sounds kind of good on paper, focusing on community healing, repairing harm, why does it become so perilous in these specific cases of systematic control?
The dangers are rooted entirely in that power imbalance we spent the first part discussing. RJ, in these contexts, often provides impunity to perpetrators. Because the process is fundamentally aimed at reconciliation and closure, it frequently glosses over, or maybe actively ignores, that fundamental power imbalance. This severely increases the risk of recurring violence because there's a severe lack of true accountability. If the perpetrator's central motivation is control, then a mandated reconciliation framework just becomes another powerful tool for that control. It can actually force the victim to comply, to reconcile, for the sake of appearing peaceful or cooperative.
That's a chilling thought. It's like the perfect example of just releasing the steam valve, a minor, maybe temporary reconciliation without actually turning off the heat source, which is the coercive control itself.
Exactly. And tragically, we have a devastating real-world example from Indonesia that illustrates the consequences when this legal inconsistency plays out.
Right. We need to recount the heartbreaking case of Mega Suryani Dewi in Bekasi, West Java. It really underscores the risk.
This case. It provides the necessary emotional weight, I think, to understand the legal peril here. Mega Suryani Dewi was killed by her husband. But crucially, this happened after she had previously taken the incredibly courageous step of reporting him to the police for abuse. That initial police investigation, however, had been dismissed earlier, and the reason given. The husband claimed they had reconciled.
Claimed they'd reconciled.
Claimed. That supposed reconciliation, which was almost certainly achieved under enormous pressure from the abuser, maybe family, maybe the community, effectively halted the legal process. It provided the husband with this dangerous sense of impunity. It basically signaled to him that the system wouldn't hold him accountable. And this lack of intervention, tragically, preceded her death.
Wow. That just highlights a terrifying systemic issue, doesn't it? A really dangerous lack of clarity in the law itself about when reconciliation is even appropriate, let alone safe.
The situation is definitely exacerbated by a vacuum of clear regulations. There's often no definitive rule on when gender violence cases must be excluded from the restorative justice process. In Indonesia, for instance, you might find police, prosecutors, and judges operating with different internal regulations, different interpretations. It creates this chaotic system where victim safety just isn't guaranteed. This legal inconsistency is a massive threat because it allows the coercive power of the perpetrator to manipulate the very process meant to bring resolution.
And tragically, sometimes the victims themselves feel pressured into pursuing this dangerous path. Not because they genuinely want reconciliation, but maybe because the traditional judicial system just feels economically inaccessible to them.
That financial coercion is a huge, often silent driver. Victims might feel overwhelmingly pressured into seeking RJ simply because they lack the financial means or the stability or maybe just the emotional resources to endure the long, taxing, and often expensive judicial process required for formal charges. So in this way, the restorative approach can become a path of least financial resistance rather than a path of true healing or justice, and that just maximizes their vulnerability again.
Okay, so if the legal framework often fails victims in these situations, and the real goal should be to target the offender and genuinely change their behavior, not just achieve some kind of paper reconciliation, how are intervention models evolving? Are there alternatives beyond just punishment or these risky RJ approaches?
Yeah, this is where we're seeing some structural innovation trying to get at the root causes. Traditional offender programs, like the widely used Duluth model, They focus very heavily on confronting male privilege. The program uses that famous power and control wheel to explicitly frame IPV as a tactic, a strategy, to maintain gendered power. So it's an approach that's very externally confrontational, quite ideological.
Right. I'm familiar with the Duluth model, but newer approaches, like something called ACTV, they seem to be shifting the focus. Maybe less on external privilege confrontation and more towards internal emotional regulation and self-awareness.
That's exactly the significant philosophical development we see with models like ACTV, which stands for Achieving Change Through Values-Based Behavior. ACTV is based on Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or ACT, and it aims to teach abusers situational awareness. The core goal isn't just confronting an ideology, it's about addressing the actual emotional mechanisms that trigger the violence.
Okay, how does ACTV use those principles then? How does it aim to reduce reoffending?
Well, the underlying assumption is that a lot of IPV stems from an inability to tolerate uncomfortable feelings. Frustration, jealousy, feeling vulnerable, which then leads to an emotional explosion to rage. ACTV teaches the abuser mindfulness techniques, acceptance techniques. It helps them learn to recognize and, crucially, tolerate these uncomfortable feelings before they explode. It encourages them to commit to values-based behavior, things like practicing patience or showing respect, even when they're feeling emotionally dysregulated. And the initial evidence, comparing ACTV participants to those in more traditional programs, showed quite a bit of promise. Significantly fewer ACTV participants acquired new charges, specifically domestic assault charges or other violent charges, in the year following treatment.
That's interesting.
It suggests that maybe teaching internal awareness and emotional tolerance skills might be more effective, or at least a vital complement, compared to solely relying on external confrontation about privilege. So if we accept that the sort of mechanical logic of equal force fails us, and that the confrontational or even the reconciliatory legal systems often fall short because they don't address the core power dynamics, then the final crucial step, perhaps, is to consider frameworks that prioritize prevention through developing moral and spiritual strength. This is about internalizing values.
Right. We're moving beyond policy and prosecution here into something much more foundational, a kind of cultural shift. And this section looks specifically at Javanese wisdom from Indonesia, which offers a really powerful perspective through this lens of spiritual intelligence. This feels like the ultimate contrast to my friend's rigid input-output logic we started with.
Absolutely. It's a completely different paradigm. We're looking at spiritual intelligence rooted in Javanese philosophical values, seeing it as a potential base for, well, multicultural politics and sustainable social solidarity. And what's really crucial here is that this framework emphasizes the cultural aspects rather than focusing solely on religious dogma. It's about deep-seated values informing behavior across all aspects of life, not just in a religious context.
And the centerpiece of this wisdom, the concept that really jumped out, is Tepessalira. This is the one that really speaks to preempting violence by fostering deep empathy, isn't it?
Tepessalira.
Yes.
It's often translated simply as politeness, but its deeper meaning is much more profound. It's about deep empathy. It's the capacity to truly feel what others feel, almost as though it were happening to you. It's seen as a vital virtue within the Mataraman society, which is historically the Javanese elite community. And you can see how it functions as the ultimate preventative measure against self-centered control, right? It forces the self to recognize the potential consequences of its actions before they even occur.
And Tepessalira isn't just about external manners, being polite on the surface. It's intrinsically linked to a whole, quite rigorous practice of internal self-governance.
Exactly. It's deeply tied to 4 interconnected practices of introspection. Practices that really encourage self-governance, rather than relying on external blame or waiting for the law to step in. These are, first, mawas diri. This is kind of the general state of self-awareness and self-correction. It's the habit of constantly evaluating your own motives and behaviors, especially in the context of the community. Second, nading saro. This is the act of comparing yourself with others, but specifically to understand your relative position, maybe your privilege. It's meant to foster humility and reduce judgmental or controlling attitudes, particularly towards those who might have less power. Third, nukorsaro. This literally means measuring oneself against a moral standard. It's the process of using your own feelings and experiences as the benchmark for judging how your actions will likely affect others. It's like the golden rule, but deeply internalized and actively applied moment to moment. And fourth, mulatsaliro. This is a deep, critical self-reflection aimed almost exclusively at finding your own faults and defects rather than constantly criticizing others. This practice is really about ensuring internal accountability.
Wow. That's That's a challenging lifelong prescription for a living. If you're constantly practicing mulat saliro and ngukrusero, you're essentially preempting the need for the legal system to impose accountability from the outside. You're internally governing that pressure cooker.
It completely internalizes accountability. If you truly practice Tepessalira through these methods, you preempt the need for that mechanical, reactive input-output response we talked about at the start, because your own emotional mechanism is constantly measuring potential harm, constantly seeking emotional balance before conflict can even escalate into violence.
Okay, there's another concept we saw tied into the spiritual intelligence, Narimo ing pandem. How does accepting what is given by life translate into a nonviolent coping mechanism? How is it different from just resignation?
That's a really crucial distinction to make. Remoing pandem isn't passive resignation. It reflects a profound conviction, a kind of spiritual intelligence, to endure difficult life conditions without resorting to reactive external struggle or violence. It's fundamentally a survival strategy based on inner strength. To truly practice remoing pandem means dedicating your energy to adapting, to coexisting peacefully, rather than constantly fighting what might seem inevitable or trying to control external factors through force or complaint.
And we have that powerful example of this practice in action, right? With the Javanese migrants who relocated to Maluku.
Yes, exactly. When these Javanese migrants moved to Maluku, they faced immense systemic adversity. They encountered huge issues, like the land being incompatible for their traditional farming methods. They faced the discontinuation of necessary government subsidies they relied on. And maybe worst of all, they faced severe communal conflict with some of the local populations. But by activating this spiritual intelligence, particularly Narimo and Pandem, they were able to cope with these really low life conditions and difficult transitions. Instead of viewing the local population or the challenging land primarily as adversaries to be overcome by force, they focused their energy on internal resilience, on adaptation. And this, remarkably, enabled them to eventually build social solidarity with the local community, rather than resorting to deeper conflict or suffering internal breakdown. It shifts the focus entirely from an external conflictual struggle to finding internal peace and perseverance.
That's such a powerful lesson, isn't it? Endurance born from a kind of active acceptance becomes the source of cultural strength, and that leads potentially to peaceful coexistence, even in difficult circumstances.
And that coexistence, that positive outcome, is further amplified by one more concept, Memayu Hayuning Bawana. This value translates roughly to beautifying the world, or maybe maintaining the safety and beauty of the universe.
So it moves beyond just personal introspection or endurance to a kind of collective, proactive responsibility for the whole community, for the environment.
Precisely. It becomes a shared calling, a shared responsibility, what the source called a sense of vocation. This cultural framework, when it's genuinely applied in a pluralistic society, enables diversity to be seen not merely through the lens of tolerance, which, let's face it, often implies reluctantly just putting up with difference.
Right. Tolerance feels passive.
It does. Instead, Memayu Hayuning Bawana encourages active, responsible engagement and mutual appreciation in daily life. This feels like the ultimate preventative measure against the kind of systemic conflict that breeds things like intimate partner violence, because it fundamentally replaces self-centered control with collective responsibility, and crucially, that preemptive empathy we saw in Tepessalira. #Chagdautragdarter.
You know, we started this deep dive with my friend's very rigid, very logical equation for conflict. Input equals output. Simple. Tidy. And that led us through the incredibly complex, often heartbreaking realities of intimate partner violence, where we found that human relationships, especially under duress, aren't governed by balanced equations at all. They're governed by asymmetrical power dynamics and this chronic cumulative pressure. The system we saw, intimate terrorism, it's all about control, not balanced conflict.
And we discovered that trying to apply simplistic legal fixes, even well-intentioned ones like restorative justice, to this deep-seated control problem often fails spectacularly. It can risk the lives of victims, like Megas Suryani Dewi, because, as you said, it just releases the steam without ever truly turning off the heat, the source of the coercion. The path toward genuine safety and true equality seems to lie in, yes, strict accountability when harm occurs, but maybe more fundamentally, in deep internal work.
And we finished by embracing this profound humanistic framework from Indonesia, Tepessalira, and its relating practices of deep introspection. We found that perhaps true prevention lies not just in laws or programs, but in cultivating the moral and spiritual capacity to genuinely feel the potential pain of others, thereby preempting the violence that seems to stem from unchecked, self-centered control.
The challenge we face now, though, is significant. If models like ACTV show us that psychological intervention can shift an individual's internal landscape, and if Javanese wisdom demonstrates that entire cultural frameworks can mandate rigorous internal self-awareness and empathy, then we really have to ask. In our modern, often highly individualistic legal and social systems, systems that rely almost entirely on external punishment and measurable legal processes, how do we effectively incorporate the collective wisdom, the spiritual intelligence embedded in concepts like Tepessalira? How do we build systems that foster genuine prevention, rooted in empathy and self-awareness, rather than just reacting with belated intervention after the harm is already done? That feels like the structural gap we must somehow figure out how to fill if we truly hope to dismantle that pressure cooker once and for all.